We move now to our third paper from Alex Pryor, The Reinforcement and Disruption of the UK's Parliamentary Narratives Through New Visual Cues.
What I wanted to discuss, I suppose, through this presentation was some of the new visual cues that we can see through things like the use of Zoom, Teams, in particular the juxtaposition of that and the parliamentary chamber, for example, and committee rooms, that sort of thing. I wanted to discuss this very much from a narrative point of view. So just in order to provide a little bit of definition early on, we'll be going with quite an orthodox view of narrative propounded by people like Roland Barthes, who talks about narrative as this idea of ordered mixture of substances. So this idea that there is a sequential nature to narrative, there is a structural nature to narrative, bound up of things that are in themselves, in certain instances, purely incidental or even coincidental, but have been tied together in a meaningful way in order to express some idea, some concept. In terms of what these substances are, I've relied a lot on a much more recent source from Nirmal Puar on this idea of when we look at particular sort of rooms, when we look at particular galleries, even vents, obviously statues, paintings, that kind of thing, we see a building up of contested stories from which to say something about what Parliament is, what Parliament does, and what Parliament means. So in combining the two, and hopefully a coherent view of what these parliamentary narratives are, as they're understood within this presentation and this kind of discussion, is this idea of an ordered mixture of storytelling substances. But the contention here is that the use of Zoom and Teams, those kind of video conferencing technologies, have added new substances into some of the visual discourse. So we've seen this in the past. There's an example from a couple of years ago when MP Peter Bone wore what was described at the time and by independent sources as a silly hat. I'm casting no aspersions on that. It had a close link to his charity work. But it was jumped on by John Bercow as something that would be ideally never seen again by anyone in society, but especially in the House of Commons. This was allegedly a violation of the 1988 ban on hats. Yes, there is indeed a ban on hats in the Commons, not under the pretext of how it makes the MP look, but how it makes the House of Commons look. This kind of thing, I think, is thrown into sharp relief in Zoom discussions and web conferencing within this kind of legislature. It's by no means specific or peculiar to the UK. There have been similar sort of outcries and debates happening in Canada, for example. But we've also seen sort of calling out of political slogans. So the particular speaker in the House calling out something that is seen to be in some sense political, or we might say partisan. But the important point here is that, outside of purely being present in the chamber, political representatives, elected representatives, are able to now broadcast in some sense their immediate surroundings into parliamentary premises, and by extension to viewing publics, especially if it's a high profile case like PMQs or a particularly noteworthy debate, so on and so forth. And this is a rupture of sorts with the fact that for centuries, largely Parliament has had, visual cues and the way in which these are ordered and presented all to itself. It's been parliamentarians and staff who have been responsible within the location itself, within the perimeter, within the premises, for what is visually on display. And this raises new questions about symbolism, about the narratives of Parliament. The way in which this has been talked about and described in media discussions and just in sort of popular discourse has typically been quite superficial in nature, so sort of quite surface level. Things like this idea, I think it's from iNews, that there's a new window into MPs' personalities. This is very much to be taken on a case-by-case basis. But the closest thing we get to an analysis, in some sense, is talking about how Liz Truss, people like Ian Blackford, obviously, who I've written about in the past in this capacity, and Alistair Jack, are able to signify, at a national level or a more local level with football paraphernalia or local landscapes, that kind of thing, their own constituencies. We'll come back to this later, but Emma Crew's idea of the MP as a living symbol of their locality, I think, is really relevant here. There's a couple more ways in which, again, we very much see this sort of superficiality narrative. So just ranking flag backdrops, ranking their homes, this kind of thing, which doesn't necessarily tell us very much about what the MPs themselves are transmitting into the chamber. We do, however, see some slightly strange examples that from a symbolic point of view or a narrative point of view are quite intriguing. I would welcome any examples if anyone thinks that they can top this, but the best one, or the most interesting one that I found so far, is MP Clive Betts talking in a COVID-19 debate with a Lego reproduction of the Palace of Westminster on top of a grand piano, which, again, through a symbolic lens, tells all sorts of slightly conflicting stories about, well, we won't go into questions of privilege and perceived distance between MPs and society, but again, I think this kind of image, and I think an entire paper could be written on this particular image, and it would not be a wasted paper, tells us all sorts of things about how these kinds of pictures can be arranged. Again, we're talking about curation of objects and arrangement of visual surroundings, whether or not that is shown to have any link to the constituency or not. But the interesting thing to me, or perhaps the most interesting thing, is some of the fear and anxiety that this stirs up. Obviously, we've kind of talked about this very briefly in terms of political slogans, which in itself I think is an interesting question in terms of what is the dividing line between what is a political slogan in the background and what isn't, what's noteworthy for a speaker to call out. Perhaps kind of go into that in the Q&A perhaps. But there have been anxieties inside and outside the membership of the Commons about this idea of, politics, democracy is better done face to face. I've written about the slightly militaristic implications of Rees-Mogg's conclusion, so we won't dwell on it too much here. But it's interesting to see that it's, again, sort of made special note of that the UK Parliament is maintaining, in the face of these hybrid proceedings, continuity and tradition in terms of these symbolically laced objects like the symbolic and historic mace being still placed on the table. But also we had commentators like James Graham, who I believe is a playwright, talking about how you need physical proximity in order to build and maintain empathy, which is an interesting point of view for a playwright, I think. But he also mentions, I think, very illuminatingly, that there's no Microsoft Teams in ancient Athens. I suppose I can say this to a legislative group that there weren't a lot of things in ancient Athens, including a model of democracy that we would support and seek to emulate. But again, that's a different discussion. But it's interesting to see, again, these this fallout of some of the perceived sort of narrative ruptures that are happening against this visual backdrop and in terms of these contested visual cues. My conclusion, and I suppose a riposte of sorts to this kind of anxiety, is this idea that when we do see these backdrops, even if there are sorts of, ridicule, jokes, conclusions of that sort, I would say that we still see some form of demystification. This is still a really important facet, I think, about, again, this idea of Crew's, about living symbols of locality. It's hard to see a more clear manifestation of that than when you're seeing, again, sort of children running around in the background, paintings, paraphernalia, objects that are symbolically worthy, necessary to the MP. And I think that in this very way, this is a means of generating the same kind of empathy that Graham, I think, is sort of mentioning as a loss in these hybrid arrangements. And I think it can really play a complementary role in terms of obviously that necessary face-to-face contact, but also being able to have precisely that window into MPs' personalities, whatever that window happens to be and whatever that window happens to show. I also think there's a broader point to be made here theoretically, and this is very consistent with the work of, well, the ones I mentioned previously, but also ones like John Parkinson, this idea that these narratives are contested is not the same thing as contesting the sort of raison d'etre of Parliament itself. This idea that narratives are contested, I think, is absolutely central to the identity of Parliament in the first place. It's central to some of its problems at the moment, but also to what we might say is an identity, or at least multiple overlapping identities. This idea of contestation within reasonable normative bounds, I think, is one of the things that defines the UK Parliament. So the idea that this is some form of rupture, or this is some sort of precarious situation, I don't think is necessarily founded in practice, and certainly not in theory. It's the idea of we are still in a case of narrative flux when it comes to the UK Parliament, and when we get to things like Zoom and Teams, that sort of thing is continued in a highly visual way, in which we can see these real manifestations of these contested narratives, but also windows and opportunities into a greater sense of relatability, or at least greater potential for relatability. So this, I think, is absolutely central to and consistent with parliamentary functions. I will leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time.